Hi, my name is Alicia Mullings on October 30th, 2019, and this is my presentation for medical physiology at University of New England. So this is my presentation on hormonal control of implantation and early embryonic development during pregnancy. So first, I really wanted to cover embryonic development as a whole. And so first phase, you'll have kind of ovulation. During this time, the ovaries will release eggs and wait for sperm to attach it and fertilize it. So fertilization is considered to be the union of the egg and the sperm. And this fertilization process must occur within 24 hours of ovulation. It's a fairly small window for that to occur successfully. Now, once the egg has been fertilized, it becomes what we call a zygote. And once it does become a zygote, it goes through several phases before it reaches the final stage of becoming a blastocyst. So once it is fertilized and becomes a zygote, mitosis occurs. And during this time, it will divide. So when it's a fertilized egg, it'll start off with one and be a zygote. Then it'll divide into 2, into 4, into 8, into 16, and then become that blastocyst. Now, this mitosis occurs while the egg is actually traveling through the fallopian tubes until it becomes the 16-cell stage, which we also call the morula. And then once it hits that 16-cell stage, that is the last stage before, it enters the final stage of becoming a blastocyst, and then it is ready for implantation, and then implantation can occur. So I just wanted to go over a little bit more about the implantation overview. So implantation is the process by which the embryo attaches to the endometrial surface of the uterus, so the uterine wall, and then actually invades the epithelium. And so implantation typically occurs about 7 days after fertilization. Again, it is also a limited window for that to occur, and is the implantation window. And so again, once that occurs after fertilization, the embryo actually continues to multiply. So as we saw when it becomes a blastocyst, at about day 5, the blastocyst occurs to be about 70 to 100 cells, so quite a bit from where it first started, where it was dividing from 2 to 4 to 8. And so once that happens and it becomes a blastocyst, it will eventually lose what we call the zona pellucida, that outer shell, and then it'll try to find a crypt. So a crypt is basically a little fold, I guess, in the uterine endometrium where it will receive that blastocyst after it loses that shell. And at this point, it is called apposition. So when the blastocyst actually makes contact with the endometrium, that uterine wall, it's called apposition. At this point, the trophoblasts, which the trophoblasts are actually the outer cells that line the blastocyst, they will also continue to multiply and take over the endometrial tissue. And so this is a pretty invasive process where it is crossing the endometrial tissue and it causes adhesion. So that's when the actual blastocyst and the trophoblasts will multiply and adhere to the endometrial tissues in that uterine wall. So now eventually after that occurs, after adhesion, the blastocyst will become completely embedded into the endometrium, which we call invasion, and the trophoblasts will continue to multiply and become syncytio trophoblasts. These will actually start to form what we call finger-like villi that will grow into the endometrium, which is also very vascularized and will actually break down maternal blood vessels. And all of this, while it's occurring, you'll see here in the photo, the blood vessels, those blood pockets, the syncytio trophoblasts, moving further and further into that endometrial wall, that'll actually start to form what we call the placenta. And so all of these steps, apposition, adhesion, invasion, all form to help create that placenta. Now, none of this could happen without hormones. And so the hormones are really important. There's several that kind of take place during pregnancy, especially in early embryonic development and implantation. I'm going to go over a few of, kind of the more important ones. And so just to start off with here would be the human chorionic gonadotropin. So this is actually a peptide hormone. So the first two I'm going to go over are considered to be peptide hormones. And so the first one, again, the HCG, is a peptide hormone. It's actually secreted by the placenta as well as the chorionic villi. And the secretion of this hormone specifically actually peaks at about 3 weeks of development. And it's actually the chemical that is detected in pregnancy tests. And so when you utilize those pregnancy tests and you urinate on a pregnancy test, this is the chemical that says whether it is positive. And so this hormone actually helps the corpus luteum to stay active in early pregnancy, and it's incredibly vital that that happens so it continues to produce. So if this corpus luteum stays active in that early pregnancy, it continues to produce a vital hormone called progesterone, which will actually keep that endometrium intact, and we'll go over progesterone a little bit later on. So the second peptide hormone which we want to talk about is the human chorionic somatomamotropin hormone. And so this is also a peptide hormone. There's a little bit less known about this one in terms of the pregnancy. It is also produced by the placenta during pregnancy, and it's also called the human placental lactogen hormone. And so it actually is called this partially because they believe it's potentially contributes to lactation during pregnancy as well. But, you know, the lactate can also be produced without that hormone. So it could potentially, but it is not the make or break in terms of lactation. And the other thing that it really helps to do is to alter fatty acid and glucose metabolism in a pregnancy, which actually aids in the growth of that fetus. So in fetal development, production and altering of fatty acid and glucose metabolism is really important. And so the next slide that I want to go over are more hormones. And these hormones are going to be considered to be steroid hormones. And so the first one is incredibly important. It's called progesterone. And this is secreted by the corpus luteum and also the placenta, similar to one of the hormones we talked about earlier, the HCG. And so this one is secreted by that corpus luteum actually until that placenta is ready. And then once that happens, the corpus luteum is no longer needed and will eventually degenerate. And so it will no longer be needed and therefore will eventually cease to exist. Now, this progesterone helps endometrium be ready to receive a blastocyst. And so during that time, it's the one kind of preparing the endometrial wall. It increases blood supply, the water content, and actually produces glycogen, which is a really important nutrient in the development. And so another thing that it does is relax the smooth muscle. I know we talked about it earlier, where that embryo will move through the fallopian tubes. And one reason that that happens so easily for the embryo is because this hormone actually relaxes that smooth muscle that it passes through to make it an easier transition. The last hormone here that I want to talk about is estrogen. Obviously, most people have heard of estrogen. It is continuously produced during pregnancy. And so there's several things that it does. I would say it is fairly similar to progesterone in terms of it being produced by the corpus luteum, but also later will be produced by the placenta when that corpus luteum is no longer needed. So the placenta here actually takes over a couple of really important hormone secretions, including the progesterone and the estrogen. Now, high levels of estrogen and progesterone together actually helps prevent other follicles from developing during this time. That way it can really focus on this one piece that it's already doing. Another thing that estrogen helps with is, it actually contributes to the milk secretion of breast during pregnancy. A little bit later in development, I still thought it was important to bring up here. And so these were the main things I wanted to talk about. I really wanted to bring up again the early embryonic development, what implantation actually was, and then the 4 hormones that I would say are the most important in that development. Thank you again for watching. My name was Alicia Mullings, and this was my presentation on hormonal control of implantation and early embryonic development.